Hello and welcome to IR Thinker, where international affairs are discussed. I'm Martin Zupko. Today we're going to speak about the role of business negotiations in international affairs and also as an interdisciplinary approach. So we have business negotiations on one side and international affairs on the other side. This topic I consider as very important, especially for research, because when you negotiate international business or when you speak about international affairs, you always come across negotiations. And for that, I invited my guest today, Professor William Baber.
Hello. Hi, Martin. Thank you for inviting me. I've been looking forward to our conversations. So let's go.
Professor Baber is teaching at the Graduate School of Management, Kyoto University. He has combined education with business throughout his career, especially when we consider the state of Maryland and his consulting activities, also his teaching activities in Japan, Europe, and Canada. But more importantly, he's also the author of one of the best business negotiation books in the world, and that's Practical Business Negotiation, written with the Professor Fletcher Chen. This book I really like because it's quite interesting in terms of reading, knowledge, and also you can find excellent teaching notes if you are a professor or teacher. So that's absolutely amazing. Professor's career in terms of teaching, including negotiations, cross-culture management, management communication, and also Professor Babel is very famous for his approach to students. So he's going into practical case studies, and that's very valuable for all of them. So let's start with the first question, and that question is about the multinational corporations. So Professor Baber, when we have multinational corporations, how do they use their economic leverage to influence the foreign policies of the host and home countries during high-stakes negotiations?
I think that question is right to the point. So this is something that multinationals do constantly in advance of negotiations and even when they are between, as well as during the negotiations. The number one tool is lobbying. So they will have formal lobbying campaigns depending on the legal system of that country to directly approach legislators and regulators. Additionally, though, they do things like charm campaigns with the public in mind. MNCs will do things like have charm campaigns with the public where they try to influence public opinion and reach out to influencers, talk show hosts, and so on. Unfortunately, companies also do things that are less ethical, and they may by research and expert witnesses. They may use botnets to amplify their ideas on social networks, and they may also work with conspiracy factories. And currently, in the last few years, we've seen big tech companies make really strong efforts in Europe to avoid regulation, since Europe has been more aggressive with GDPR, for example, than the United States has. So these efforts are not always successful, but that is part of the preparation work that they do before going into face-to-face negotiations and getting down to the details. I think we can also see more and more sophisticated versions of that inside the U.S. With the Hollywood studio writers union strike not too long ago. We could see that there were sophisticated efforts to use bots that were communicating with each other according to scripts and so on. Coming into the US, there's almost no restrictions on this kind of thing. So foreign actors and companies are able to do this quite a lot inside the US.
And how does a company know that it has the leverage, that has power to negotiate?
Yeah, that is a good question. So basically, your power in negotiation comes from the ability to choose an alternative, the BATNA. And if you are trying to expand your product or service into a big market like the European Union or the United States, you don't really have much BATNA. So, you can just stop selling into the European Union and only sell into the United States, but that's not really a good alternative. It's a poor BATNA. So what kind of leverage do they have and how do they know? They don't really have much. So their best bet for leverage is going to be public opinion. If they can make their product very popular, or if they can direct public opinion in the direction that they want. Again, like we said, in developing countries, they have some options to directly bribe people, but that's not, of course, the case, fortunately, in the European Union nor the US.
When I speak with my students, they always ask, how is it possible that Facebook or Apple and all those big corporations, they have like more power than the whole government? And especially when they negotiate, for instance, with the European Union, then you have the geopolitical map of states, members of European Union, and still those companies can sometimes escape regulations, and they can play with the words, how the law text is written. So that's, I think, quite interesting for international negotiations and affairs, because that's how we should understand how the company works.
So I would turn the question around and ask, what leverage do the national governments have, and why are they not recognizing it, and why are they not using it better?
Yes, and I think what I can add to this from my experience, mostly living in the United Kingdom, is also the power of negotiators as a people. Because when you have better people, you can negotiate in different way. And sometimes I found that government is slightly behind, because the corporations can afford to pay for better lawyers, better experts, even better research. So that's quite fascinating.
Yeah, I think that's very important. So a smart corporation, a smart organization, whether it's business or government, will develop negotiation teams that know how to work together, which takes time, and which have deep resources. So with governments, we certainly see this with foreign trade agreements, where they will field a very large team that's able to handle a wide range of industries and technical issues and so on. And I would recommend all organizations to consider that.
Let's speak a little bit about interest. We know that state has interest, national interest. What about corporations and companies? In what ways can business negotiations serve as a vehicle for corporate interests to shape bilateral or regional trade policies? And could this undermine or enhance the sovereignty of weaker states?
So corporate interest can shape policy quite a lot. So basically, when we think about a foreign trade agreement, that's government to government. But inside each government involved, there will be significant input and coordination with companies, usually with the big companies. And they're going to ask for things that they would like to get that will make their business easier. Now, if the other side agrees to them, that government has to go to its legislature and change a law, or at least change the regulation. So in this kind of two-step, two-layer process, businesses can cause the other country to change. This could be for better or worse. So it could mean that the products coming into the country are safer. It could mean that the products coming in are not using forced labor or child labor. It could also be the other way around, that the products coming in are lower quality. So an example of this would be that the United States exports quite a lot of frozen meat, and the U.S. businesses would like to have hygiene standards that are different, and where they can use different chemicals for sanitizing those meats. And not all countries in the world would like this, but the U.S. team in the foreign trade agreement will put a lot of pressure on to make changes on the foreign government side. And another example of this is the standards that a country might require might be very high, and they force the importing country to conform to those standards even without a negotiation. So an example of this would be automobile emissions in the United States are basically set they're set at the national level, but the stricter level comes from California. So if you want to sell to California, you've got to meet that higher standard. And if you're going to, it's not sensible to adjust your automobiles for just one state. So it means California is the tail that wags the entire dog of the United States. And at the same time, it also impacts other countries that don't have the standard or have lower standards, because the automobile makers would prefer to make one car. So this means that a strict standard, even inside of a government like the United States, it could even be a smaller state than California, can have worldwide impact on business, and also on what the rules inside a sovereign government are. So this interplay is very common, and can be very powerful.
I want to ask, Will, about the quality of those trade agreements. Based on your experience and research, what's the latest trend or development when the states are going to agree on something? And this comes from the latest development between the European Union and Latin America, because we know that those trade negotiations were going for more than 20 years. And there are negotiations between the states and between the European Union and the states of the South America or Latin America. But some people, they ask, do we have some sort of consensus where we want to move the development of those agreements in terms of quality? For instance, do we prefer something more general, or do we prefer something more specific? And then we have that sort of movement, what we want to negotiate and what actually is on the paper.
The world and the U.S. have experienced some, like you say, long, ongoing, decades-long free trade agreements or trade agreements, whether they're totally free or not, that have been unsuccessful, either because they never concluded or they were abandoned. So I think there might be a trend towards simpler agreements. So the Pacific Trade Agreement had the U.S. enter, then exit, and the final results were not very comprehensive. It may be that really comprehensive large agreements just might not work. So meanwhile, in the U.S., with the new administration coming in, there may be a redesign of those agreements between Canada and Mexico. And it's quite possible, my guess is that there might be some simplifications, and more difficult issues might be taken out. So that's the only trend I might make a guess about.
Right. How do Power asymmetries between corporations and states shape negotiation strategies. When we speak particularly about some strategic resources or technologies that are at stake.
So this is of course important too. So within the United States, so this is a corporation that's able to shape strategies. If we think about the space system, the Boeing was a major contractor for NASA for decades and decades, and SpaceX is relatively new. Now, Boeing created a new system to bring astronauts to the International Space Station, and it was not entirely successful in that the parties were not confident of the safety of the vehicle. So what to do? This means that they turned to SpaceX, which had a system available. So we're talking about the power of choice. NASA and the United States government had basically no choice. They had to work with SpaceX. The alternative would have been reaching out to the traditional Russian partner, Roscosmos, and working with them. And this would have been extremely unpopular, and national interests intervened there. So the result here is that SpaceX could set the price that they wanted to set. So where the power asymmetries basically means your power of choice again. So the Batman. SpaceX had the power and the US government did not. Now, countries can also use coercion. You know, they can write a regulation or a legislation, or they can simply seize equipment or close a business down, nationalize the assets. So there's no real defense against this. And in countries with that kind of reputation for nationalizing assets or diluting a foreign shareholders' ownership, companies need to look at that and not enter those countries. So, there is worldwide, there is a short list of countries that you're better off not going to. Now, in the example of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, a lot of businesses left, and really none of them left on good terms because the coercive power was entirely on the side of that government. And so those companies had to sell cheap or be diluted or what have you. Otherwise, firms have the ability to do lobbying, as we mentioned earlier, and this can give advantage. So like you said, they're able to hire very high quality law firms and experts to help with this. Now, more recently, new commercial technology, and I'm thinking about space observation from low Earth orbit systems, allow data about physical assets and current situations to move very, very quickly. So it can mean just a matter of hours, an afternoon or a morning, for a country or a large company to know what's happening in a particular location, what kind of assets are there, what kind of equipment, who is occupying an oil well or something like that. And this makes it this kind of available information that is more available and cheaper than in the past probably is going to make for better agreements and better enforcement, and generally will be good for overall satisfaction of all the parties, except those few parties that are intent on doing something bad.
Let's put another layer to this conversation, and let's speak about the corporations as corporate actors acting as diplomats. And that's very interesting because this is connected to not only business, international affairs, geopolitics, but many, many other fields that we sometimes even don't know, but there are always some implications. So if I put my question into one sentence, to what extent can corporate actors act as de facto diplomats, negotiating terms that carry geopolitical consequences like resource access or technological transfer?
Firms can have a very big impact. However, it might not be the biggest firms that are having the most impact. So if we think about computer chips, which is a major issue these years, the Western computer chip makers in Taiwan, the US, and Europe would very much like to sell chips, very advanced chips to China, for example, and less, normal run-of-the-mill chips to Russia, for example. And they are not able to. If they do, they will likely face pretty serious consequences. So the legislation around that is clear and enforcement is reasonably strong. However, once they do deliver equipment or large volume of chips, then it's too late. So if we look instead at the small actors, we can find that small companies that were willing to evade sanctions or work through a gray market, they have been able to make big impact, probably not intentionally. But a fantastic example of this is the technology race of the mid-1980s. So chips were just becoming a thing, and computer printed circuit boards were very important, and making them and the technologies to make them were very important. A small number of companies and smaller companies and individual consultants and importer-exporter companies moved a lot of high-level, high technology for those times, chips and boards and systems, legally or semi-legally or not quite legally into Russia or into the Soviet bloc more generally, very often through East Germany. So if you look at the news from those days, the Soviet Union was promoting East Germany as a center of electronic development and advances. And in fact, that was partly because they were receiving a flow of smuggled or gray market imports. So it was those small companies that played a role in propping up those regimes and caused the US and the European countries, this was before the EU, to change their policy and to behave certain ways. So they had quite a lot of impact. We can see this also in legal areas or less exciting technologies. So in the oil industry, the US is able to use fracking, and Europe generally does not want fracking, but this is an advanced technology that is available for sale and available for others to develop or the way they want to. It's in demand. And countries that are willing to pay for it, or willing to buy it or willing to pay for their own development of it, can turn themselves potentially into either independent oil countries or even exporters. So fracking is the technology story behind the success of the US going from an oil importer to an exporter in the early 2000s. So, technology is the thing, is a good way to consider this question.
And Will, what about if we have a state company? Because we were speaking mostly about corporations so far, But when we add to this equation a state company, how does this influence the balance of power in negotiations? So we have like state or
Yeah.
government, then we have private companies, and now we have the state companies. What's the difference?
In countries where there are state owned enterprises, those SOEs have a lot of credibility when they come to the table. So private companies may or may not have regulatory support, or they may get pushed around by some other player. But SOEs tend to have be able to go to the negotiation table and say they're going to offer something, and the partners will be confident that they can do it. And the reason they can be confident of that is that the SOE has very close relationship with the regulator, with the government ministries and agencies, or the political party, or something like that. So they'll be able to get the permits, they'll be able to get exclusive licenses, they'll be able to maybe even go and get subsidies or lower their wages or something quite drastic. So some examples of other impact that they can have is that one SOE can enforce behavior that their government views as unacceptable. So, for example, Western companies that are active in China are not really able to easily boycott cotton that is harvested in China. So they would like to boycott cotton that is harvested in China because a significant percentage of it is harvested by forced labor. However, if those Western companies talk about it or actively boycott it, they may lose access to Chinese markets. So that means that SOEs can have very big power, especially if they're representing a major economy like China.
There are two follow-up questions. One is from students, and this is, what's the point of negotiating between the state company and the government if it's basically owned by the government? So like what government says should be what company will do or not? That's the first question. And the second question, how do you see if the state company goes to a different country? For instance, a Chinese state company is doing business in foreign country. What is the impact of this company on international relations when this company moves abroad?
So the first question, why negotiate with the SOE when there's a state behind it? The main issue here is that the SOE is the port of access. It's the point through which you're going to reach that company and or that government. Now, so you have to. At the same time, however, you may be able to, a foreign company negotiating with a SOE may be able to use its diplomatic staff at the embassy or other back channels to reach inside that foreign government and influence a regulator or other party that is a decision maker. So my answer is two-part then. One, you have to negotiate with the SOE because that's who's at the table. Two, however, there may be back channels that you can use to get around them. And the other question was, what kind of impact do SOEs have overseas? An example of this would be the Chinese aluminum maker that was involved in Australia in mining and metals. So mainly iron, if I recall. This is an example from maybe 15 years ago. The SOE bought a big percentage additional of the Australian company without giving the normal warning in advance. And they purchased more shares than a foreign company would be allowed to have. And the reaction, the backlash was very strong. The Australian government intervened, and the relationship between the two companies had to radically change and was very damaged. And in this case, there was nothing in particular that I understand that was very malign or bad about that move by the Chinese SOE. They simply misunderstood what was acceptable and how they should do it, and so on and so forth.
Let's speak a little bit about international regulatory framework. And this is something that it's very complex. We know that. But what about when we have the major companies, like tech companies, energy companies, how they shape those international frameworks?
Yeah, so in the example of technology companies and GDPR, which we mentioned a few minutes ago, the American-based technology companies, Apple, Google, Facebook, etc., lobbied very strongly to make the GDPR rules weaker or to break them up, and they failed for the time being, at least. But this is likely to continue in future negotiations and competition and conflict between those companies and the European Union and the individual governments of Europe. So that's an example where there was a very strong attempt to influence the regulation that didn't succeed. Another example is data storage. So where those companies, technology companies, actually operate servers and where they store data and so on, that has the result is that where governments have required them to keep certain data onshore inside the country, they have open data servers in those locations. However, in order to avoid that, those tech companies may immediately take all data into the cloud or some other undefined way of handling it, and put it into locations that are completely offshore. And this means that this creates a business opportunity for domestic local companies to operate certain kinds of data management and storage onshore. So in some cases, the big tech companies have been able to get around the legislation, and in some cases they can't, which creates an opportunity for local businesses. And the way the national governments have dealt with it is mixed. Different ones do different things, but they may write legislation specifically to capture and retain certain kinds of data and control over it so that they can subpoena it for legal purposes, or so that they can have it available in case of disaster or something.
There is one notion in international business negotiations, and from international affairs point of view, it's quite significant, and that's the economic imperialism. And many people and many students, many researchers, they always think about economic imperialism as sort of balance between geopolitical influence and economic imperialism. So how does economic imperialism as a notion act in the international negotiations?
Well, I think our conversation so far about lobbying is related to this. So those companies, for example, American companies lobbying to get relaxed GDPR data privacy rules, probably do not see themselves as part of the American government. De facto, though, in the real practical action, they are American, and they are promoting what American companies and indirectly what the government might like. So it's not, I don't think it's really accurate to accuse, for example, American industry of economic imperialism. They're simply not that closely coordinating with the US government. They're just simply that aggressive on their own. Some of this imperialism has benefits. So again, if we have automobiles that are safer and cleaner, and we have food production and food handling that is safer and better, that's a good thing. If we look at of course, there are good and bad cases to be found. So the United States allows food coloring and preservatives and so on and flavorings that are not accepted in many other countries. And sometimes in the trade agreement negotiations, those chemicals will be identified, those molecules will be identified specifically in order to try to get them in. So, for example, I live in Japan, which has very strict restrictions and limitations on artificial ingredients. And American companies would certainly like to beat that. So far, they have not been able to.
Sometimes we think about the business negotiations through interest, but that interest, as we mentioned already, is sometimes conflicting. So how does it work when the company has slightly different interests than the government?
Sometimes these interests come directly into conflict between business and government. So an easy example of this is that American companies certainly would like to sell computer chips into Russia, and they argue that the certain kinds of chips do not really have military use, and they would like to get those profits and that cash flow. And the US government currently is blocking them from being able to do that because the idea of dual use technologies, meaning technologies that can be used for peaceful and or military purposes, is broader and broader and broader. So almost any kind of advanced technology, or maybe we can say most kinds of technology, advanced or not, can be used for good and for bad. So definitely regarding technology export restrictions, American businesses are constantly in conflict with the US government. And sometimes the US government will react to that and make the restrictions easier to allow more sales. And sometimes the restrictions become more difficult for other reasons. So this is something that is experienced in other countries for different reasons, not only with technology. So companies, especially bigger multinationals, have the resources to constantly keep these specifications and rules and regulations in discussion and to try to change them and influence them. Smaller companies simply can't afford this. However, smaller companies may join an association and pool their money and then try to influence their national governments. And, this is partly just day-to-day business. Companies need to sell and they want to sell. And they're going to push the envelope, and they're going to keep checking whether or not they can sell certain things, or if the rules or technology have changed and they can do something a little different. So this can have strategic impact on a country, but I think it's relatively normal. That's how business is.
How can interdisciplinary research uncover the mechanism through which corporations shape outcomes in international negotiations forums, like, for instance, the World Trade Organization and others?
Yeah, good, interesting question. Um, so I would like to see more interdisciplinary research covering bringing together ideas from engineering and other kinds of planning into uh, the research. So I think it's very useful to take case studies and compare, one or more case or one or more organizations and situations and go very deeply into them and try to identify those mechanisms. And tools for this include things like Petri nets and causal loop analysis and systems thinking. And these are not always comfortable for different kinds of academics. And I think we should look at sociology and econometric tools and bring them into uh, business management thinking and also into diplomatic negotiation. I'd like to see more cross-pollination between sociology, finance, management science, international relations, also journalism. So journalism has a good, excellent tradition of going deeply into cases and doing investigative reporting. And the fundamentals of that are who did what, when, where, why, how did the money move from who to what, for what reason. So that's something that can lend a lot of benefit to management science and also international relations. In negotiating, I'd like to see more work on understanding what I call the local game. So different geographies have different expectations around how they interact and negotiate, but also different industries do. And so business people know that bankers and finance people have very different behaviors than IT developers. So they know they have to go to those negotiations with different attitude, different clothing, different behavior, different expectations. And in international relations, I seems like we don't have a very good tool set for managing these local games. So very often we're stuck with some outdated ideas like cultural dimensions and Hofstede's dimensions, which, a country level dimension can never apply to the individuals that are across the table from you, let alone if you bring in complexities like what industry they're from or what their background is. So I'd like to see negotiators, especially in international relations, consider those issues and what we call procedural schemas. That's how people interact and the kind of verbal rituals that they might go through, and the negotiation macro rituals that they might take into a meetings or series of meetings. I think we should look at discourse analysis as a tool that has to be updated every several years because discourse changes and has high impact on the public and on decision makers. I think we should consider more academic tools like the cultural values developed by Shalom Schwartz and how that is relevant to managers and decision makers. So I think there's a lot more that can come out of interdisciplinary work.
And do you have any research methodologies, like tips for us, which might be effective in examining that intersection between corporate lobbying and state decision-making processes?
Maybe. I don't think my methods are too remarkable. So a case method study can be very powerful and effective. and relying on journalistic approaches can also work very well. So as I say, journalism has a very good tradition of following the money and drawing out timelines and tracing ownership and doing pretty difficult work. And I think that would benefit academics to follow their lead.
Well, what about when we speak about cases in international negotiations which were unsuccessful? What sort of lessons can we learn from them? And the last additional question to this, can we use negative case studies to learn positive ideas or visions or outcomes for or of negotiations?
Yeah, I do think that we can learn a lot from failure. And I teach my students in almost every course, unless it's very short for some reason, I teach them some failure analysis tools. And here again, we can use a variety of methodologies and tools. So what can we learn from failures? We can sometimes find very clear failures in process that the cart was put before the horse, as we like to say. Things got out of order. We can find failures like one party did not do enough preparation work or did not understand the technical details well enough, or one of the parties had the wrong people at the table. They didn't identify the decision makers. They didn't identify interests, or they didn't do a good process of interest discovery, or they didn't do a good job of a good process of problem solving or something like that. So there's definitely quite a lot that can be learned from failure. Very often we find that I shouldn't say very often, sometimes we find that basic ideas about the strategy of the organizations were not clear. So first phase of negotiation that I teach is understanding strategically the value chain. So value chains are not only for businesses, they're for all kinds of organizations, so that they know and understand where their interests are met and where their benefits come from, whether their benefits are money or something intangible. They have to know that. So that is your strategic understanding of your value chain. If you don't do that, you might find yourself negotiating with Pepsi when you should have been negotiating with Coca-Cola, to put it in a simple way. And after that, you have to you may find other process errors, like not knowing your reserve points and your BATNA and so on and so forth. Very often there are lessons to be learned around poor stakeholder management. So quite often big firms might not communicate well with regulators, or they might not communicate well with the local community, or they might disregard a consumer segment that they could have benefited from. And we should also think about, going back to the very first part of the process, you should consider your chance of your success. So, will the negotiation bring me anything? If we think about that example of American big tech trying to negotiate against and weaken the GDPR rules and regulations, those American companies did not accurately assess their chance of success. So they didn't, which means they didn't understand what the regulators wanted or what the public wanted or why. So they could have saved themselves quite a lot of money, or by not negotiating, or by taking some different approach or something. So there is a lot to be learned from failure, to summarize. And we can analyze those failures in a lot of different ways. So I look for root cause analysis to as a process to try to understand what went wrong. If you understand what went wrong, you can maybe not do it the next time or do it better. So classic tools like YY analysis work very well on soft product problems, and causal loop analysis can work well for very complicated negotiations.
Will, the last question for today's interview. We spoke about negotiations, regulatory frameworks, we spoke about lobbying and all the aspect of business in international affairs. What about the research in this field? What sort of trends you can see? Maybe what sort of research topics that you are working on at the moment, and you can recommend some of those topics to junior researchers or students who want to deal with a topic and maybe who want to contribute to that interdisciplinary area of the business negotiations and international affairs.
Yeah, I think one of the topics that is definitely of interest in the research community and in negotiation is ethics and ethicality. There have been some interesting papers recently, and I'm thinking about the paper by Smolinski and Kesting and Kircher on bounded ethicality. And a little bit related to that, of course, is sustainability and SDGs and how negotiations in business or other areas might go. Something that I'm working on that is progressing very slowly is the differences between different kinds of negotiation. So I see business negotiation and international relations negotiation as fairly different. So they definitely both rely on basic universal, I think universal things like concept of BATNA and target points and so on and so forth. But then there's a lot of difference and variation. So a business person will know, an experienced business negotiator will know what the ZOPA is, what their maximum and minimum is and what they expect the other side to bring, and if it's not in the ZOPA, they know to walk away. A ZOPA in the context of two different countries and their values and their interests and their changing leadership and so on and so forth is much, much less clear. Maybe it's not even a useful idea. Also, the complexity of government-to-government relationships, especially where there is a bad history, and there might be wicked problems. I'm sure your listeners will know the concept of wicked problems that are very deep set and complex and not easy to resolve and may have deep resentments involved. Those require more research and more effort and more work, I think. The business world doesn't have so many of those. So I think there's some clear genre differences that, or I think they're clear. Some researcher needs to go and figure out what the different types are. So maybe I'll get some work done on that in the next year or so. Other things to work on are anything regarding space. So space is a little bit like maritime situation and the situation on the open seas. So there is less ability for a country to enforce what happens on the open ocean or in outer space. But the more agreements and norms that we have in place, the better it is for everyone. So international arbitration can work for some cases and doesn't work where you can't enforce it. And what happens in space if your equipment destroys someone else's equipment? What happens if your equipment brings back to Earth some kind of problem or virus or don't know what? What happens if you bring equipment to a inhabited space habitat in orbit or on the moon, and you bring a virus or a disease to them? How are you going to manage these things before they happen or after they happen? So there's all sorts of interesting things to be done. So I recommend researchers to get busy and go do it. And new technologies, of course, like AI are coming into play, and this will lead to a lot more conflict about who owns what kinds of words and training data and bodies of data and who contributed to it, and so on and so forth. And how can money be? How can proceeds be shared? How can responsibility be shared? So this means there should be a lot of case studies that can be done, as well as basic theory. So theory helps up to a certain point, but practicalities carry the day. And I very much believe, like the title of my book says, I very much believe in the benefit of practical negotiation skills. And case studies are a great way to understand practicalities.
Will, many thanks for your insightful thoughts and that you shared the research with us. This field offered so many opportunities for researchers, especially interdisciplinary research. And especially in these times of geopolitical dynamics, we might be very interested in practical business negotiations and how to see that practicality, as you mentioned, from the perspective of international affairs and from the perspective of international business. Will, thanks again for being on IR Thinker.
Martin, thank you very much for having me and keeping a good conversation. Thank you.